So good to see everyone today. You hear this term a lot these days about human flourishing. It's a little bit of sort of a new agey thing, I think, but it also has some relevance to our practice, I think, and we can look at the term and the whole notion of human flourishing through a Buddhist lens, which is what I want to attempt to do today, and not as an abstract philosophical ideal, not as a mystical destination, but really as something that's practical, a steady development of mind and heart that prepares us to meet life's challenges with clarity, with resilience, with compassion. And I don't have to tell you that the teachings of the Dharma, the practical Dharma, describe a path that is both concrete and usable. It doesn't have to be esoteric. It's how to relate wisely to our life experience, to our thoughts, our emotions, how to reduce unnecessary suffering, how to build the inner conditions that allow well-being to take root. But rather than tying flourishing, as it often is, at least in Western culture, to external achievements, from a Buddhist perspective, we would anchor it in the quality of our inner experience, of our inner world. And from this perspective, flourishing is not about becoming special per the ego or acquiring more in terms of material possessions. It's about learning how to live more skillfully with what we already have, not having to add more. It's the gradual alignment of our actions, our intentions, and our understanding so that our lives become less burdened by reactivity, by always reacting to the external environment. Our lives become more infused with balance, with purpose, with ease. And to understand this notion of human flourishing from a Buddhist perspective, we start from the straightforward observation at the heart of the Dharma, which is that suffering exists, and it's not necessarily limited to external trauma or dramatic life events, although that's certainly the case, but it includes those more subtle everyday stressors, our irritations, our anxieties, our disappointments, the feeling, that kind of nagging feeling that something's missing, something should be different, something should be better. And our path invites us to look closely at those experiences, not wallow in them, not sort of just, take them on in terms of victimhood, but to understand them. Because when we recognize how often our minds become tangled up in craving and aversion and confusion, the three poisons the Buddha taught, we begin to see that suffering is not an external enemy. It is a pattern. And patterns can be changed. That is the beauty of this path. Because the path offers a clear, practical framework for this change, for this transformation, centered around three pillars that the Buddha brought to us. Ethical living, which is sila in the Pali, mental cultivation, which is samadhi in the Pali, and wisdom, which is panna. Think of these as the stability that derives from these three pillars as the three-legged stool. Each pillar supports the others. It creates a holistic approach to flourishing that really touches all aspects of our daily lives. Starting with ethical foundation. It's so important because a conflicted life that is inconsistent with our values creates a conflicted mind. If we regularly speak harshly, act out of anger, pursue our desires without regard to impact, we inevitably generate stress for ourselves, for our others, and the world around us, and suffering results. Ethical conduct is so fundamental because it provides the stability needed for the deeper work of mindfulness and insight, the other two legs of the stool. It is foundational. And in practical terms, it just means living consistent with our values of honesty, reliability, respectfulness, and the like. Okay. It means acting with kindness. It means avoiding actions that lead to inner turmoil and the suffering that accompanies it. One important way that ethics contributes to flourishing is by creating a sense of coherence between our values and our behavior. They align. So we flourish by living our values, the alignment of our values and our behavior. When our actions align with what we believe is wholesome, we experience integrity. This kind of inner alignment gives rise to confidence, to calm. We don't have to expend energy justifying our unskillful actions. When we live inconsistent with our values, it's a lot of work to justify the behavior, to project the blame outward, to do whatever we need to do to not have to acknowledge that we've behaved unskillfully. Even small ethical choices, like choosing patience in a tense moment, or telling the truth when exaggeration would be easier, and on and on. These small choices strengthen this integrity. And over time, the payoff is that this builds a life that feels less chaotic. Why would you say? Because we're not constantly dealing, as I said a moment ago, with the consequences of reactive or harmful actions. So that's ethics. The second pillar is mental cultivation. This is about focusing our attention, training our attention. Our attention is constantly being pulled in countless directions. We're distracted. We have emotional impulses. We have habits of the mind. We have cultural pressures. We have our phones. We have our computers. On and on and on. Without training, without an intention to train, the mind moves automatically from one reaction to the other. And this often amplifies our stress. It's what we often refer to on this path as monkey mind. It's just bouncing around like a monkey in a tree. By cultivating mindfulness, by cultivating concentration, we steady the mind. We learn to observe our experience without immediately being swept away by it and reacting to it. Now, meditation is obviously one tool for this training, but mental cultivation extends beyond just sitting down and meditating. It involves simple practices such as pausing before responding in a stressful situation, noticing the first signs of irritation or whatever rather than acting on it, taking a moment each day to check in with the body, to check in with the breath, because these daily subtle practices strengthen our ability to notice what is happening in the present moment, so we are not operating on autopilot. Okay. A well-trained mind is like calm water. It reflects things clearly. And this clarity helps us make wise choices, non-harming choices, skillful choices, choices that lead to well-being rather than greater stress and greater suffering. When we are able to see a difficult decision without immediately reacting, without that hair trigger, we create room for patience, for creativity, for compassion. That opens up the space for creating these more favorable conditions. And this capacity is essential for flourishing as we're defining it today, because it breaks the habit of habitual, unchecked suffering. It opens the door to living more skillfully. So that's concentration and mental focus. The third pillar, the third leg of our stool, is the deep understanding of how life actually works, the wisdom. Wisdom in Buddhism is not intellectual brilliance, it's not philosophical sophistication. It grows from closely observing our experience and becoming familiar with it. We begin to notice, for instance, that everything changes. That's impermanence. That clinging to permanence creates tension and suffering. That our sense of self, our stories, our identities, our fixed positions are more flexible than we often have realized or that we assume. This is the kind of wisdom that the Buddha asks us to pursue. It is profoundly practical. So, for example, when we fully understand and embrace this notion of impermanence, it helps us appreciate moments of joy without clinging to them. It helps us endure moments of difficulty without despairing, because in both cases, we know these things are impermanent. They will not last. So when we recognize the fluid nature of ourself, for example, it allows us to let go of rigid roles, rigid expectations. It reduces unnecessary conflict born of holding on to that rigid sense of self. And this, at the end of the day, helps us manage our egos more effectively. We know what a challenge that can be. Seeing that emotions are simply temporary patterns and our stories rather than absolute truths, seeing that that's the case helps us avoid making impulsive decisions when we're angry, when we're fearful, when we're suffering. So when wisdom and mental cultivation deepen, we gradually stop expecting life to be different than it is. We stop expecting life to be different than it is. And I don't mean this in terms of passivity. I mean it in terms of realism, a realistic view of life. We handle challenges more effectively because we're not wasting energy resisting reality. We're not wasting energy resisting the truth of what's happening. And this is a central component of flourishing as we're defining it today. So that's the three-legged stool, and we take that into all of our life's experiences. Now, another component of this, I won't necessarily call it the fourth leg of the stool, but it's certainly important, is the role of relationships and well-being, the role of community. Because flourishing is not an individual project. It blossoms when we meaningfully connect with others. Kindness, generosity, empathy, patience, all qualities that not only enhance our personal well-being, but the well-being of those around us. That's why we have Sangha. That's what happens in Sangha. We bring that to each other twice a week here. When we cultivate these qualities, our relationships become a source of mutual support, not a source of stress and conflict. Because in a real sense, to flourish as a human being is also to contribute to the flourishing of others. We're interconnected in that way. And then another key to flourishing is the freedom that arises when we loosen the grip of craving and aversion. Much of our stress and suffering, as you know, comes from wanting things to be a certain way, the way we want them, and getting distressed when they are not that way. But when we learn to hold our desires lightly, as I often say, hold them lightly, like a baby bird, if you will, and we respond to difficulties without harshness, we free ourselves from a great deal of unnecessary suffering. Now, this is not dramatic, it's not esoteric, it's not mystical, it's very practical. It shows up in everyday moments. How we handle a delay, how we handle a frustration, a conflict, a disappointment, a moment of insecurity. We have countless opportunities during the day to hold this stuff lightly. So flourishing in a Buddhist sense is not striving for reaching some peak experience that the culture might ask us to do. It's like cultivating a garden. We talked about that recently. We talked about what seeds we're watering. A consistent, patient effort that develops gradually, not in a big, flashy way, but through thousands of small choices that we're presented with every day. We choose honesty over convenience. We choose presence over distraction. We choose kindness over impulse, curiosity over defensiveness. The list goes on and on. And like a garden, flourishing depends on the conditions we create. Like I said, the seeds, what seeds are we watering that we talked about last week? When we nurture the seeds, the conditions of ethical integrity, mental steadiness, and wisdom, well-being naturally takes root. It is there waiting to bloom, to sprout. Now, let me say here, and this is critical, and I couldn't stress this more strongly, flourishing does not require a perfect life, because we're going to be hit with illness, with loss, with aging, with uncertainty, with heartbreak. all these kinds of conditions that every one of us has or will face. And there's no promise from the Buddha or anyone else that to remove these experiences. But what he did promise was how to meet them without collapsing into despair, into hostility, into giving up, into victimhood. Yes, a flourishing person still suffers, but they suffer differently, with greater understanding, with less fear, with a greater sense of connection to others who are also struggling. And in this way, flourishing becomes a quiet strength. It's not flashy, it's not showy, it's not, as I said, reaching some peak. It's the strength to remain open, the courage to remain open and compassionate in a world that is constantly changing. It is the capacity to live with purpose and kindness, not driven by fear, not driven by craving. The ongoing practice of shaping our lives in a way that reduce harm, deepen understanding, and foster greater inner peace. From a Buddhist perspective, to flourish is to awaken to our own potential, and we all have this within us, for clarity, for kindness, and freedom. And it doesn't require extraordinary ability. There's nothing mystical or supernatural about it, as I said earlier. It only requires the commitment, the steady attention, the honest self-reflection, and a willingness to cultivate the qualities that we know contribute to genuine well-being. When we do this, we discover that flourishing is not something we chase after. It's not more degrees, more successes, more promotions. It is something we grow like a garden, moment to moment, in the way that we meet our lives. So those are some thoughts this morning on human flourishing, from a Buddhist perspective.